Grace and peace to you in the name of Jesus.
Amen.
I grew up here at St. John's. In fact, when I was a little girl, St. John's met in the old St. John's in a different building, and I don't know the name of the street offhand, but then there was a bank in the building. But I remember coming here to this site where this church is built with my mother when it was just a field. And my mom walked around with a real estate agent looking at the property and trying to determine if it would be a good site for St. John's. And I remember eating blackberries. There were lots of blackberry bushes right where you're sitting right now. And I ate the blackberries where she talked to the real estate agent. My parents were very active at St. John's. They loved St. John's, and they're now buried in the Garden of the Resurrection here at St. John's, which makes it especially meaningful for me to be here on All Saints' Day. Although my mother had more time to dedicate to volunteer work than my father did, my father is the one who insisted that he and my mom should join a Lutheran church. And then my parents passed on their faith to me, and I was ordained right here, 32 years ago. And Pastor Moore 32 years ago, she was at my ordination, and she played her guitar and sang. With this history, you can imagine how shocked I was to discover that my German father, who came to the United States in 1938, was Jewish. And that soon after he arrived here, my grandparents were taken to a concentration camp. I was shocked. I had and continue to have a range of emotions about it, and I'll talk more with those of you who come to the forum. But right now I want to look at the range of emotions with you in today's gospel. When Jesus comes to the tomb, there is a whole commotion of emotion. There's sadness and grief, of course. There's also disappointment and anger. Lord, if you had been here, says Martha, my brother would not have died. And soon after that, her sister echoes that angry, disappointed feeling, and even the neighbors who wonder why Jesus didn't do more. Jesus, which is so wonderful, does not tell them to swallow their anger. He doesn't say, well, if you only had more faith, you wouldn't say such things, you wouldn't feel such things. There's room in this story for tears, for struggles, for disbelief, even for anger. Here in this story, we have room for the ragged edges of our real feelings and questions in the face of death and other grievous losses. As Jesus himself approaches the tomb, he's overcome with emotion. It says he's deeply disturbed. The early church fathers say that one of the words describing Jesus' emotions here is boiling mad, that he was mad that death had robbed the temple of Lazarus' body. He weeps. He not only accepts the feelings of those around him, he shares them. Then Jesus asks Mary to take away the stone from the mouth of the tomb. It's too late, protests Mary. Martha, by now there will be a stench. A stench. I have read this story for years and preached about it, but this year when I came to those lines, I heard them in a new way. This is the first time that I read the story in light of my father's Jewish heritage, my grandfather's murder by the Nazis, my grandmother's near starvation. I can only guess at my father's motives for keeping it a secret, hidden away. Fear of new repercussions in a frightening world, hate speech against Jewish refugees in this country, the desire to distance oneself from trauma, the desire to protect loved ones. Whatever the reason or mix of reasons, a heavy stone of silence was pushed over this history, closing it up, intending to shut it away forever. After all, what was hidden inside stank. It was corrupt. It was horrible. Why remove the stone of silence? Why remove the stone of time? Why not let the past stay in the past? It's too late, protests Martha. By now there will be a stench. Yes, there will. After 4 days in the Middle Eastern heat, corruption had run rampant. Too late to undo that. Better keep that corrupting, stinking reality hidden. Shut up. Now, Martha's desire to keep the stone over the mouth of the tomb is perfectly understandable. And certainly I do not attribute any ulterior motives to her stance. Likewise, I do not attribute my father's silence to any desire to inflict harm. To him, it made sense. To him, it was probably the most loving thing to do. But a stone covering the stinking tomb is not always placed there in a spirit of love. In Lübeck, the German city where my father was baptized and later confirmed in the Lutheran Church, the stench of corruption from inside the church could not have been stronger. My grandparents had their children baptized at St. Mary's Lutheran Church for what appears to be reasons of assimilation. But then, at some point, Bishop Balser came to St. Mary's. He was a tall man who stood in the pulpit preaching a weekly message of hate in a worship service that fomented anti-Semitism, surrounded by Nazi flags that were hung from all the Gothic columns. As to the baptism of Jews like my father, the bishop proclaimed, "Just as a pig remains a pig, even if you put it in a horse's stall, so a Jew remains a Jew, even if he is baptized." Balser was one of 11 church leaders who launched a Nazified church movement at the Wartburg Castle, where Martin Luther went to hide after he was excommunicated and where he translated the Bible into German. One of the most important acts of the Reformation, making the Bible accessible to average people so they could hear God's words in their own language. Bishop Balser and the other leaders of this group launched their campaign of hate at the Wartburg Castle, where they openly advocated for the extermination of Jews because they wanted to present their work as an extension of Martin Luther's Reformation. Now, Hitler's reign of terror ended 70 years ago, and yet, for some, a stone of silence has been placed to block the stench of evil. During a wartime firestorm of bombs, the huge cathedral bells at St. Mary's came crashing down in a heap of bronze wreckage. When I visited there with my parents as a little girl, I remember being stopped by this disturbing scene in an otherwise gorgeous cathedral. It was very weird to me that this broken pile, this mess was just left in the back of the church. And it was clear, even to a child, that something bad had happened there. But what was it? The only commentary on this memorial says that the cathedral was bombed during the war. We're kind of directed to see the church as a victim of war, rather than a complicit partner, a perpetrator. We get a sanitized version of that church's history. A few years ago, I was invited to preach at that church. It was an opportunity to speak words of life in a pulpit that had been used to promote death.